The biggest lie we've been taught about the human mind is that thinking more solves life. Thinking more only exhausts you. Controlling more only creates tension. And the harder a person tries to predict everything, the further they get from the peace they're seeking. The curious thing is that almost no one notices this. Most people spend their entire lives trying to organize the external world while the real chaos is happening inside. Bentov said something uncomfortable for the ego. The universe doesn't respond to effort, it responds to your inner state. This idea challenges everything we've been taught about success, security, and control. The mind wants guarantees. It demands answers. It wants to know the next step before taking the current one. But the universe doesn't operate on that level. It communicates on a different frequency, one that only becomes accessible the moment a person lets go of control. Mental suffering doesn't come from problems themselves, but from resistance to them. Constant worry, fear of the future, and the feeling of always being behind in your own life stem from trying to control a system that's already intelligent by nature. While the mind fights, life flows. While the ego demands certainty, the universe signals subtle paths that go unnoticed. Surrendering everything to the universe doesn't mean giving up on your life. It means stopping the fight against it. It means trading anxiety for trust, tension for listening, blind effort for alignment. This surrender doesn't make anyone weak. It makes them clear-headed. It frees the mind from the burden of trying to carry the world alone. This video doesn't offer empty promises or quick fixes. It reveals a shift in perception capable of reorganizing how a person thinks, feels, and lives. Along this journey, something starts to fall into place internally. The mind slows down. Fear loses its authority. And what once seemed confusing begins to make sense in a quiet, deep, and transformative way. If your mind feels tired, if control no longer works, and if life seems to demand more lightness than effort, this content didn't arrive by chance. It marks the beginning of a different way of relating to the universe and to your own consciousness. The universe isn't just a vast, lifeless space, a cold, purposeless matter. It pulses, vibrates, and responds. According to Itzhak Bentov, the universe is a living intelligence. At its core, it doesn't react to our rational efforts or the control we try to exert over it. Instead, it responds to our inner states, to what we truly feel in our soul. When we stop seeking answers through logic and open ourselves to inner silence, we begin to notice a higher intelligence, a source or spirit, guiding our steps. This presence isn't distant from us. It doesn't require us to understand every detail or have absolute control over situations. On the contrary, it invites us to trust it, to surrender to the flow of life. This can feel difficult in a world where we're constantly pressured to control every aspect of our existence, but true surrender isn't passivity. Surrendering to the universe is actually an active choice, a choice of faith. It's not about waiting for the path to be clear and visible, but about walking even without seeing every step ahead. In this process, the ego, which always seeks certainty and predictability, puts up resistance. It wants control. The heart, however, wants trust. And that's where the universe speaks. Every synchronicity, every coincidence, every unlikely encounter or situation carries meaning. This only becomes clear when we quiet the mind and listen with the heart. The universe doesn't give us answers in words, but in silent gestures, in the subtle touches of our daily lives. And by opening our minds to this, we see there's a much greater and deeper path than the ones our logic allows us to perceive. In this process of surrender, a transformation takes place. Fear often arises as an obstacle, trying to pull us back to old patterns of control. But by resisting the temptation to control everything, we can see what truly matters. The ego wants assurance that we're doing the right thing, but the universe doesn't demand that. The universe demands trust. And trust comes from realizing that behind every movement, there's a wisdom that organizes chaos, connects all things, and directs them toward a greater purpose, one we often can't grasp right away. This surrender isn't giving in to emptiness. It's surrendering to the flow of life, an acceptance of what is without resistance. Now, as we surrender, the journey unfolds before us, and it's from this trust that we begin to understand that not everything is linear. The universe responds to our soul, to our deepest state. And as we become more attuned to what's happening inside us, we start to realize we're not alone on this journey. What seems like just walking through the unknown is actually a dance with the cosmos, and that dance reveals itself in the next stage of our understanding. Surrender to the universe begins to show its effects in how a person starts to view their own story. What once seemed like mistakes begins to take on a new meaning. In Bentov's view, consciousness learns through movement, through trial, through direct experience. The path isn't built in a straight line, and insisting on only predictable routes creates inner tension. Life, in its natural intelligence, expresses itself through curves, turns, and apparent detours that carry deep meaning, even if that meaning isn't immediately clear. From this perspective, error loses the weight of failure. It reveals itself as adjustment, a necessary shift to reposition consciousness in a place more aligned with its own evolution. Humans tend to resist this process because we've been conditioned to believe that always being right has value and that making mistakes shows weakness. This conditioning breeds guilt, fear, and rigidity. The universe, however, doesn't work with punishment. It works with learning. Every step off the expected script carries essential information for inner growth. Bentov often explained this process with the image of life's natural flow. A consciousness that fights against this flow wears itself out, creates anxiety, and feels constantly threatened. A consciousness that learns to float, to feel the movement and adjust to it, discovers that the energy once spent on resistance now supports clarity and presence. Floating doesn't mean giving up your own direction. It means recognizing that absolute control isn't part of life's nature. Rigidity breaks, fluidity learns. At this point, fear begins to lose its power. Fear arises from trying to predict everything, guarantee outcomes, and avoid any discomfort. When we realize that detours also lead somewhere, the mind relaxes. Anxiety, which feeds on the idea that something went wrong, starts to dissolve. Experience comes to be seen as part of a larger process, where every event has an educational role. Consciousness stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts sensing, "What is this teaching me?" This inner shift completely changes the relationship with the past. Stories once revisited with pain begin to be observed with understanding. There's no denial, no romanticizing of suffering, just clarity. Clarity allows us to recognize that certain encounters, choices, and breaks were necessary to shatter old patterns. The universe reorganizes a person's path not to punish them, but to free them from structures that no longer support growth. Along this process, something subtle begins to emerge. The feeling of being lost diminishes. Even without clear answers, consciousness starts to trust the movement. Life stops being a battlefield and becomes a space of continuous learning. The detour stops being a threat and becomes a language, and that language starts pointing to something even broader, an invisible network connecting all experiences, all beings, and all cycles of transformation, preparing the ground for a deeper understanding of consciousness itself. As a person becomes more receptive to life's flow and less rigid in the face of detours, a broader understanding begins to form. Bentov devoted much of his work to the insight that consciousness isn't isolated within each individual. It manifests as a unified field, a living network connecting all forms of life. Nothing happens in isolation. Every experience, encounter, and rupture is part of a larger movement reorganizing consciousness. In this unified field, even what seems like chaos carries evolutionary intent. A mind trained only to judge events as good or bad tends to trap itself. It creates fixed narratives and lives inside them, repeating patterns without realizing it. Most people operate from an inherited mental script, built from family beliefs, undigested emotional experiences, and repeated habits over time. This script shapes perception while reinforcing what the person believes to be real. Consciousness ends up seeing only what confirms its own programming. Bentov noted that the mind can serve as a tool for expansion or as a prison. What determines this isn't the content of thoughts, but the degree of identification with them. Without self-observation, a person believes they are their thoughts. They react automatically, interpret everything through old filters, and lose touch with the broader field of consciousness. With self-observation, inner space emerges. That space allows thoughts to be seen as passing events, not absolute truth. This recognition deeply changes how we handle pain, loss, and instability. What was once seen as collapse begins to be viewed as reorganization. Inner structures need to break down for new forms of consciousness to emerge. Discomfort doesn't signal error, it signals transition. The universe reorganizes what no longer supports growth, even if the mind resists. Self-observation then becomes an essential practice. It's not about controlling thoughts or forcing positivity. It's about noticing recurring patterns, automatic inner dialogues, and silent beliefs that guide decisions without being questioned. By bringing these to awareness, a person starts to rewrite their relationship with their own mind. Freedom doesn't come from the absence of thoughts, but from not being dominated by them. Within the unified field of consciousness, each individual influences the whole and is influenced by it. Inner states naturally shape outer experiences, without excessive effort. This realization dissolves the sense of separation. Life stops being a series of random events and becomes a constant dialogue between inner consciousness and outer movement. This dialogue sets the stage for an even deeper step. By recognizing patterns and flexing the mind, real conscious transformation becomes possible, not superficial change, but an inner reorganization that alters how a person thinks, feels, and positions themselves in the world. This process points to the ability to reprogram one's own consciousness, a movement involving intention, presence, and alignment with life's natural flow. Once consciousness recognizes its own patterns, something profound begins to shift internally. Bentov saw this point as decisive. Perceiving how the mind works creates space to transform it. Thoughts don't arise randomly. They follow familiar tracks, reinforced by emotional repetition and constant attention. Every sustained thought shapes the inner experience and, as a result, how reality is perceived and lived. Reprogramming consciousness doesn't happen through force or imposition. It happens through alignment. By shifting inner focus, emotional frequency changes too. A person begins to vibrate differently and naturally starts attracting experiences compatible with that new state. It's not about desiring specific outcomes, but about living in coherence with a broader flow. Consciousness learns that excessive effort creates tension, while alignment creates natural movement. Bentov looked to nature as a great teacher of this process. Life's movement happens without resistance. Everything transforms at the right time. Nothing clings to what has already served its purpose. A tree releases its leaves without conflict. A river moves forward without carrying the stretch it has passed. A butterfly doesn't return to the cocoon because it understands, in its own structure, that each phase supports the next. The same principle works in human consciousness, even if it's often ignored. Attachment emerges as one of the main blocks to inner reprogramming. Attachment to old ideas, rigid identities, relationships that no longer reflect who the person has become. This attachment creates resistance and blocks natural transformation. Letting go doesn't mean losing. It means making space for something more aligned to emerge. A consciousness that understands this begins to experience change with less fear and more clarity. Spiritual neuroplasticity, in this context, shows that the mind isn't fixed. It responds to attention, intention, and conscious experience. Every inner choice creates new connections. Every sustained emotional state reorganizes perception. The outer world begins to reflect this movement subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Small inner changes lead to major shifts in how life presents itself. Relationships reorganize. Projects take new directions. Goals stop being impositions and become natural extensions of the self. A person realizes they don't need to force outcomes. They need to maintain inner coherence. The universe responds to this state of alignment with flow, not as a reward, but through resonance. This process doesn't eliminate challenges. It deepens the capacity to move through them consciously. Every inner transformation prepares the ground for a more refined level of perception. Consciousness begins to understand that real change always involves a kind of inner transmutation, a process that turns fear into clarity and experience into wisdom, opening space for an even deeper movement of the soul. The process of transforming consciousness deepens, silently and inevitably. Bentov described this stage as spiritual alchemy because it doesn't depend on belief, effort, or willpower. It's an inner phenomenon that arises from honest contact with one's own experience. Consciousness begins to work on itself, converting dense states into understanding, tension into presence, and pain into clarity. Nothing is rejected in this process. Everything gains a function. Fear, insecurity, and confusion stop playing the role of enemies. They reveal points of consciousness still needing integration. The conditioned mind tries to escape these states, seeking distraction, control, or quick explanations. Alchemy begins the moment this escape stops. The person stays present with discomfort and realizes it doesn't destroy, it only reveals. This presence transforms the experience. What once imprisoned begins to teach. Bentov observed that consciousness doesn't evolve by accumulating knowledge, but by refining perception. Difficult situations return at different stages of life, not by chance or punishment, but because each return offers a new layer of understanding. The outer scenario may look similar, but the level of consciousness is no longer the same. Automatic reactions lose strength. Inner space emerges. That space is alchemy in action. At this point, the ego starts to lose its centrality. Rigid identities based on control and external validation become unstable. This weakening creates discomfort because the ego fears disappearing. What actually happens is a shift in the center of consciousness. A person stops defining themselves solely by roles, stories, and expectations. A broader state of presence begins to sustain the experience, one that doesn't depend on success, approval, or external security. Pain, in this context, stops being seen as failure. It becomes language. Every uncomfortable sensation points to a needed adjustment, to a perception not yet matured. Consciousness starts to listen instead of react. This movement completely changes the relationship with crises. They lose their threatening nature and take on the role of inner reorganization. Spiritual growth, according to Bentov, doesn't follow a linear progression. It manifests in spirals. Consciousness revisits familiar themes from new perspectives, always with greater depth. What once caused collapse now generates understanding. What once paralyzed now strengthens. This inner refinement builds a stability that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Over time, a person realizes they don't need to eliminate fear to move forward. Fear loses power from lack of resistance. Clarity arises from continuous observation, not from trying to control outcomes. This is the true transmutation of spiritual alchemy. Experience stops being a burden and becomes living wisdom. This inner state awakens a natural need for sustenance. Consciousness seeks simple, consistent ways to stay aligned, not as an escape from the world, but as active presence in it. This movement naturally leads to incorporating conscious practices that anchor this level of perception in daily life, preparing the ground for the next deepening of this journey. A consciousness that has gone through observation, inner reorganization, and alchemy begins to recognize something essential. Elevated states aren't sustained by intellectual understanding alone. They need anchoring. Bentov emphasized that human consciousness naturally oscillates. Without simple, consistent practices, the mind returns to old patterns, not from failure, but from habit. Sustaining presence requires intimacy with inner silence. Meditation emerges here not as a sophisticated technique or a search for extraordinary experiences. It presents itself as a return to the inner point where the mind slows down and perception expands. In silence, consciousness reorganizes itself. Mental noise loses authority. The universe's language doesn't come in clear sentences or grand images. It manifests as a sense of alignment, quiet clarity, a knowing that needs no explanation. Bentov saw meditation as a fine-tuning of consciousness, like tuning an instrument. It's not about controlling thoughts, but allowing them to dissolve naturally. In this silent space, a person recognizes they don't need to respond to everything or decide everything immediately. Life finds its own inner rhythm. The body relaxes, the mind opens. Intuition gains space to express itself without constant ego interference. Gratitude acts as another profound anchoring force, not as automatic repetition of words, but as an inner state of recognition. A consciousness that feels gratitude aligns with life's flow. It stops operating from lack and starts seeing value in what's already present. This shift reorganizes emotional vibration and changes how reality responds. Gratitude doesn't magically change external events. It changes the inner point from which those events are experienced. Simple rituals play a key role in this process. Conscious gestures create bridges between the invisible and the everyday. Lighting a candle with presence, writing a desire with clarity, ending the day by acknowledging lessons. All of this organizes consciousness and reinforces intention. The power of ritual lies not in the object or action itself, but in the inner state that accompanies it. Conscious repetition creates vibrational stability. These practices don't pull a person away from the world. They deepen presence in it. Spirituality stops being something sought in specific moments and starts manifesting in daily choices, in how we listen, speak, and act. The sacred stops being distant and begins to inhabit the everyday. Over time, consciousness realizes it doesn't need complex rituals to stay aligned. It needs inner sincerity, attention, and consistency. This alignment creates a more direct relationship with the universe, a silent communication based on trust and listening. The journey doesn't end here. It stabilizes. And that stability opens space to integrate everything experienced into a more conscious, freer, and truer way of being. Everything shared so far doesn't ask for belief. It asks for experience. The universe doesn't require a person to understand every detail of the path, just to be present enough to notice the signs. The mind can keep trying to control, predict, and anticipate, but real change begins the moment that pattern is observed and questioned. The lingering question isn't whether the universe is trustworthy, but whether the person is willing to let go of the illusion of control that keeps them exhausted. Surrendering to life's flow doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities. It means acting from a clearer inner state. It means choosing with clarity, speaking with presence, and living with less mental noise. A consciousness that trusts stops wasting energy on constant worry and directs it toward what truly matters. Fear loses ground. Anxiety decreases. Life starts responding more fluidly. Now comes a decisive point. What will be done with this understanding? It can remain just information, or it can become daily practice. The mind tends to slip back into old habits, racing thoughts and the need for control. Noticing this is already consciousness. Every small aligned choice creates real change. Every moment of silence strengthens inner listening. Every conscious gesture reinforces trust in life's flow. It's worth observing how reality itself responds to the inner state. What changes in relationships? What shifts in decisions? What loses importance? What gains clarity? These questions don't demand immediate answers. They demand presence. True spirituality doesn't happen in lofty ideas, but in how a person lives the everyday. If this content touched something deep, don't let it get lost in the noise of daily life. Apply it, observe, experiment with living with less resistance and more listening. Transformation doesn't happen all at once. It begins the moment consciousness takes ownership of its own movement. If this journey resonated, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every piece of content deepens this path of consciousness expansion, bringing clarity, presence, and a new way to relate to life and the universe.